Welcome, everyone. I see that our attendees are starting to join the Zoom. I'm going to wait a few minutes to give everyone a chance to join, and then we'll get started very quickly. All right, why don't we get started? Thank you very much for joining us tonight and welcome. My name is Heather Norborg and I'm the Lifelong Learning and Literacy Manager at the Evanston Public Library. On behalf of your Evanston Public Library, I would like to welcome you all to tonight's program and take this opportunity to thank the panelists and moderators that are joining us tonight. I'm going to turn it over very quickly to our moderators, but before I do, I'd like to remind everyone that this is a two-part series, and next week on Thursday, May 20th, will be the second part of this series. And so I invite you all to join us next week as well. So tonight, I'm going to turn it over to one of our moderators, Ilana Marder-Epstein. Thank you, Ilana.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm going to start just by sharing my screen. I'm starting this presentation. It is so good to be here with you all. I cannot see your faces, but I know that you're in this space with us, so welcome. My name is Ilana Marder-Epstein. I'm one of the moderators tonight, and this evening we'll be speaking about the legacy of school segregation in Evanston. Again, this is part one, really investigating our history and taking a historical approach to this topic. So glad to be with you all. So firstly, I just want to begin by situating the land that we are talking about, the land that Evanston resides on, by acknowledging that the land that Evanston sits upon is the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. The North Shore was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other Native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. So we do this because it's important when looking at our city's history and the roots of racism and white supremacy to also explicitly name colonialism underpinning these systems of oppression. So tonight, I just want to give you all a pulse of who you'll be hearing from, the moderators for this evening. So we are part of a group called Talking Whiteness, which is a group of youth organizers specifically located in North Evanston, talking about anti-racism, whiteness, and white supremacy within our context in our lives in that area of the city. So these are North Evanston photos for you all to enjoy and see us in. So I'm the baby there in the backlot t-shirt. I grew up near the backlot, went to Kingsley Elementary School, Haven, and then ETHS, and I'm a ETHS 2013 grad. Lydia Collins is another one of our co-organizers. She's not able to be here tonight, but I will pass it off to Blair to introduce herself.
Cool, thank you. And yes, my name is Blair Frett. That's me at my graduation from Bessie Rhodes. And I also went to ETHS, graduated in 2012, and my family lives in the 6th Ward still.
So the agenda for this evening, we will be facilitating the introduction and just giving you a brief overview of of our work that Talking Whiteness has done. And then we will hear from Dina Robinson and Mary Barr about the histories of Evanston's educational system and segregation within that context. And then we will be facilitating a Q&A. So just some housekeeping. In the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button. And that is where you can put any of the questions that arise as we're going through this presentation. We're going to capture all of those and then bring them up at the end of the panelists' presentations to get into those questions and have a Q&A. Feel free to drop any comments in there as well. So that's, again, the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, probably at the bottom right. And I will hand it off to Blair.
Great, thank you. So now we're going to segue a little bit to how we got to this event tonight. So for a little bit of personal background, as a white kid growing up in the 6th Ward, I was always aware of kind of the differences, or that there were differences in our neighborhoods. You know, growing up and even today, walking around my community in the 6th Ward, the houses are very big yards, very large lot sizes. And when I would walk across the canal to get to ETHS in the 5th Ward, you know, the surroundings change. The houses are noticeably smaller, the lot sizes are smaller. And so kind of as a little kid, I was, you know, noticing these differences, but didn't necessarily have the language to really understand why or what I was seeing. And lo and behold, no surprise to anyone, when you do look at sort of these differences between our wards, there are a lot of differences, and within those differences, a lot of different stories to be told, and a lot of history that can be seen. So we can go to the next slide. And so to kind of like take a deeper dive into that, if we're looking at the 2012 referendum votes for placing a school in the 5th Ward, you know, if you're looking there, Ward 6 and 7 were the 2 wards that voted, you know, predominantly no for putting this school in the 5th Ward. And if you're looking at the map on the right, the blue dots are representing white folks. And so, you know, here we have our 2 predominantly white northern wards in Evanston, also the ones voting no on this referendum. And this kind of, you know, got our group thinking a lot about why is it that our particular neighborhoods voted this way. You know, it's common rhetoric, you know, among my family and my neighbors that we kind of moved to Evanston so that, you know, I could go to a diverse school. But it kind of got us thinking, you know, who is that diversity benefiting? And yeah, and kind of how does that play out in our daily lives? So we can go to that next slide. So when we began our organizing work last year, one of kind of the key points of our organizing was to look at inequities in our education system, kind of among other things. But certainly a guiding question was sort of, given, for example, how people voted on that referendum, what does that say particularly about our community? So it was very like a personal turning inward moment of kind of looking at specifically the 6th and 7th wards. You know, why is it that people voted this way? Can we have honest conversations about our histories, about our blind spots, about our own whiteness and how white supremacy plays out in our daily lives, how we are complicit in it? And so kind of from there, we formed a collective of about 30 youth, ranging from the ages of like 16 to, I guess, 27 now. And yeah, really our goals were to kind of turn inwards and be very honest with ourselves and our neighbors, and also kind of see this as an opportunity for growth. So when you look at those, you know, statistics, and you're looking at the 6th and 7th wards voting predominantly no for a 5th Ward school, you know, while those realities are frustrating and disheartening, it's also sort of an opportunity for, hey, like maybe if I talk to my neighbor, maybe if we talk about our history, maybe if we talk about why we are or know where we are today. Maybe that'll change a couple of minds and get some people in the 6th and 7th ward voting in favor of a 5th ward school.
So a little bit about what we did. Throughout the summer, we hosted conversational stations along Central Street with these 3 posters and guiding questions for the dinner table to encourage folks to come by, be in dialogue with our facilitators, and then take a photo of the 10 questions for the dinner table to bring back home. Again, turning inwards and being in conversation about anti-racism efforts that could happen in North Evanston. So these are some of the scenes, the stations across Central Street. And as you know, as Blair mentioned, a lot of our conversations centered our educational system, as we are youth, and that is our shared experience in Evanston, walking through the hallways of our schools. So that brings us to our presentations from our historians. I'd like to introduce Dino Robinson, who is the founder and current executive director of the Shorefront Legacy Center. Shorefront collects, preserves, and educates people about Black history on Chicago's suburban North Shore. A graduate of Loyola University with a BA in communication design and a minor in African American studies. Outside his career in advertising and design, his advocacy with the creation of Shorefront began in 1995 and has since accumulated over 350 linear feet of archival material illustrating the lives and experience of Blacks on the North Shore for public use. He is the author of 3 books, Through the Eyes of Us, Gatherings, The History and Activities of Emerson Street Branch YMCA, and A Place We Can Call Our Home. Through Shorefront, he has engaged the local community, preserving its history through articles and oral history, provided resources for public use, participated in dozens of lectures on the topics of the importance of community-based archives and local history. So we are so delighted to have Dino here to present to all of us, and I will pass the mic over. Thank you so much.
Thank you as well, and thank you for hosting this tonight. Thank you, attendees, for taking some time out this evening to listen to us. We'll try and make this informative, and I'll try and not make it too dense, but as informative as possible. I'm going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint slide presentation to show that has some audio and video to it as well. I'm trying to capture this within 20 minutes, so I may speak fast, but please, as noted, put any questions in the Q&A and or in the chat, and I'll hopefully be monitoring at the same time that I might be able to see some of the questions and incorporate them into my speaking points as well as I go forward. So with that, I will start and kind of introduce you in the lens of the history of Foster School, which I think addresses a lot of things that we are anticipating on covering this evening. Foster School I use as the symbol of how Evanston formulated its segregated practices in the city of only 8 square miles. And I found it to be unique over the time when I was working on this because of the situation of how Evanston presented itself as a diverse community. So, Foster being that symbol, it established in 1905, and Ellen Foster was its first principal. Ellen Foster was a principal, had her own school that she started on Emerson Street. In the 1905, she was hired by the then School District 75 to be the first principal of Foster School. What's interesting about her legacy as a principal at Foster School, I think she was a trailblazer in many ways. One of the last things that she did before she ended her tenure in teaching, she ran for superintendent in 1918. She lost the race, but her platform was challenging real estate agents and banks about segregating neighborhoods. And she made a comment saying that if you are to move forward with segregating communities, you'll have a profound impact on neighborhood schools that would be virtually impossible to reverse. She lost the election, but I think throughout its history, her words actually were foretelling what happened in Evanston. So as I stated, Evanston built Foster School in 1903, casting a vote to levy a tax bond, and Ellen Foster was the first school. Foster School was named after Randolph Sings Foster. So there are like several Foster families that you see Foster Street, Foster School, but none of it attributed to Foster School's first principal, Ellen Foster, different Foster altogether. But when it opened in 1905, and just indicative of the area that we're talking about within the Fifth Ward, the Fifth Ward was more of a diverse community, but the student body was predominantly white, taught by an all-white faculty. But by 1945, the student body was nearly 100% African American. So that was really telling how fast Foster School became a symbol of segregated practices in Evanston. And it's a visual example of that. Here is a class of Foster School, 1912. During that time period too, between 1900 and 1930, you had a rapid growth of the Black population in Evanston. So in 1900, there were 737 Blacks. And according to the United States Census in 1900, the Black population pretty much lived everywhere in Evanston. It wasn't just situated in one area. So you had about 200 Black bodies living in the immediate downtown Evanston area. And then all parts of Evanston, as it was divided up as Central Evanston, South Evanston, and North Evanston. A lot of it still kind of at the time, not quite fully incorporated into the Evanston we know today. Kind of give you an idea, this is how Evanston looked at the time. It encompassed, before about 1883, it encompassed also a lot of Rogers Park. And those dots around there was incorporated, were showing where the Black communities were, but by 1930, most of the Black community was pushed into one area of Evanston, and we now know it as the Fifth Ward today. This practices happened because Evanston did adopt practices in Jim Crow, although it was not a legal policy in its books. By example, by mass control, they practiced as a social construct the policies of Jim Crow. So they started segregating beaches, segregating public facilities, and with comments telling Black people that you should know your place, don't challenge the system. But despite that, there was a growing Black community that was pretty much self-sufficient, minus the access to banks and hospitals until their hospital was built by 1914. But with that, that started the precedent of bringing a bigger segregated school system in Evanston, and Foster School became that symbol. By 1925, there was an addition put to the building that added a theater and additional classrooms for the anticipation of expanding the school from a K through 5 to a K through 8, trying to keep as many Black students in one school in the city of Evanston as much as possible, so some of the students would not matriculate to the middle schools in the surrounding areas. And with this housing, and you'll find that neighborhood schools are really developed by housing patterns. So Jim Crow, redlining also played a part in this. And so because that area in the Fifth Ward was where most Black population was pushed into, created the term de facto segregation, where a community that is predominantly made up of one group of people, the neighborhood school then becomes literally a segregated school by default of the housing that's surrounding it. But to further that and to enforce that, the city of Evanston oftentimes redrew the school district zones to make sure as many Black families went to the foster school or were zoned for the foster school. So for example, if a Black family moved onto a block that was predominantly white, they could rezone that school system where the boundary would be drawn around that Black family's house, where that Black family would then have to go to foster school, but all the other students on that block can go to whatever their neighborhood school is in that area. And so by 1933, by the 1930s, this is a representation of what the classes started looking like at foster school. So a distinct difference between 1912 and 1930s. However, still during the 1930s, the teaching staff at foster school was predominantly white, with the exception of Charles Boyer, who was the unofficial teacher, gym teacher, who was hired to, quote unquote, keep the Black students in line. It was still impossible for Black teachers to teach in the city of Evanston up until 1942. Some of the first teachers in Evanston, as I mentioned, Charles Boyer, who was a physical ed teacher. Gene Hunter came to take that over in the 1950s. Dr. Wendell Lanton in 1942 was a principal there. And then Lorraine Morton, when she first came to Evanston, that was her first teaching position at Foster School before she went on to Nichols, then Shute, and then later as principal at Haven School. The significance, though, about foster school, what it did, even though it was segregated from the rest of the community, the PTA was extremely strong. It built a tight-knit community where families, teachers, and children, students, all alike, had this sense of belonging, networking, and support structures that were needed. So if there was ever a need for, let's say, a student production, the foster PTA would get together, raise funds, make costumes, build sets, whatever's needed for the community's needs. I remember interviewing families where they'll say that, oh, I don't want to come home from school and find my teacher at my home, because I know they're talking I'm talking to my parents about how I can improve my scholastic endeavors at the school. So just hearing those stories from families that grew up in the neighborhood and attended foster school, extolled the virtues of how important that school was to them, the network was for them, and how they were supported as a community, as a family, and as students. 1958, there was a fire in Foster School, and this predicated a first idea of moving and integration processes in the city of Evanston. As when the fire was put out, they had to figure out what to do with all the students at Foster School. And they're divided up by grades. I think kindergarten class went over to just next door to the Foster Recreational Center, but other grades went to additional schools, but were separated from that school. So the Black students would attend at, say, Haven, but would be separated and have their classes in the basement or in the library or in the lunchroom area. Or actually, not even the lunchroom area yet, because there was no in-school lunches at the time. So when the schools closed down for lunch, the Black students had to figure out how they're going to get home or sit outside until schools open up again. And that restarted the whole issue of in-school lunch programs. The school was rebuilt, and some additional photographs of the devastation of Foster School. But the school was rebuilt, and the thought process of integrating the schools were still heavy on the school district board as well as the city of Evanston and what to do. And understanding too what was happening across the nation with integrating schools, the city of Evanston wanted to get ahead of that in some meaningful way. And they instituted a program to start a magnet school. So where the classrooms were predominantly African-American, they're looking at ways to integrate the school in a new, unique way of creating a magnet school, busing white students into foster school for a experimental program. At the same time of doing busing students in, it did displace Black students who were foster school was their neighborhood school, and they were bused to other surrounding schools. In fact, introducing and integrating, starting the integration process of other schools. So in doing that, creating the experimental school, it started with the lower grades, kindergarten, first, second, and third grade, and they were holding classes in the lower level of the school, of Foster School. This later became known as King Lab, and so King Lab was birthed at Foster School. There was active discussion about busing, about neighborhood schools at that time period. Unfortunately, we have a film clip that helps illustrate some of that. And here is some commentary on this.
Riding a bus to school and shooting to school. I think if parents would, look at things from the child's standpoint rather than their own, that the children like schools. I think they think this is fun.
Well, I feel that all the schools should be close enough where within walking distance. I don't really feel that a child should have to take a bus. In a community of this size, I don't think that it's necessary.
Well, I don't think that it should be. I don't think it should be in fact. I think integration is good, but I don't see any reason to take kids out of their areas. But my sisters don't seem to mind it, and I don't mind it. Too much.
No, I wouldn't want them to be bused. I think it'd be too much trouble.
I think that.
So that was like some of the commentary from the public about busing, about neighborhood schools and the importance of neighborhood schools. Of course, that's just a small sampling, but there was a large campaign around that. And I'm sure that as we move forward in Mary's presentation, I think she might address some of that as well. In addition to this, we want to know what was happening with the instructions. And this is Gregory Coffin talking about this.
And eliminate de facto segregation, both Negro and white, in the schools. And this means, for us at least, a redrawing of boundary lines, which actually maintains the neighborhood school concept, since our board believes in the neighborhood school concept, but at the same time provides for integrated education for all boys and girls. As you are aware, this involved the elimination of one neighborhood school and the creation of a laboratory school. And with the help of the computer, we redistributed the school population, eliminated that school as an attendance area, which left that school as an empty school building. Then we said we will create a laboratory school for experimental purposes in that building and allow youngsters to volunteer to enroll in that school.
So that kind of gave some of the structure of how the school is being done, but what wasn't really fully explained to residents in the Fifth Ward was how the lottery system worked, where white families, to attract white families to the program, they put out brochures and questionnaires to encourage families to send their students to Foster School. The Black families in the Fifth Ward thought they would automatically be involved in this whole process, not knowing that the students that are coming in will replace and move other Black students out of the schools. And a lot of times these family members were not notified that until closer to the school year. I think there's a previous question here I've seen in the Q&A, how were Black families pushed into the Fifth Ward and who did the pushing? It was a combination of things. It was primarily redlining, real estate agents, banks' refusal to make mortgages available to Black families, and the whole concept and the social construct of Jim Crow policies and practices that rendered a lot of Black families in many times powerless to control their own destiny in the city of Evanston. So we skipped a little bit. So the Foster School was an experiment that kept growing, and the experimental school within Foster School kept growing, and later was renamed to the Dr. Martin King Jr. Laboratory School. And as the classes matriculated, it thus over the years ended the historic Foster School students. So as Foster School students graduated out, the new level of King Lab students would take the place of that, and then over time, Foster School then became known as just King Lab. And the program kept growing, and you had these photographs now having this racialized balance of schools. By 1976, there was a growing movement to move the foster school into, the laboratory school to a new location. Skiles School was built around the same time that the rebuild of the burnt out section of Foster School was rebuilt, early 1950s. The idea was to move the experimental school, King Lab School, to the former Skiles School, where it's located today, just off of Dempsey Street and I think McDaniel. But that necessitated the closing of multiple schools in Evanston, and Foster School was one of those schools. And to note the impact on it, I think that also answers one of the questions in the Q&A, where was Foster School located? This green shaded area is the 5th Ward. Foster School was located right here, right in the middle of the 5th Ward. When King Lab closed out of Foster School and moved to Skiles, it moved to this area right over here. So where King Lab exists today. But if you notice with the school boundaries here, how it dissects throughout the 5th Ward. So the entire student body of children that used to know each other, neighbors that work together, PTA mothers that work together, are now dispersed between Kingsley, Lincolnwood, Willard, Walker, Dewey, and Orrington. And that really broke up a community. Now, to give an example, sorry, I went a little too far there. Let me back up one, because this is my last slide anyway. So to give you an example, I'm going to show you where I live roughly and what that meant for my daughter when she went to school. So if I can get back one slide. There we go. There we are. So I live right here, right on the border of the 5th Ward. The way this is situated, my daughter was to go to Lincolnwood School. Even though we're closer to Dewey, Walker, just to create and maintain the balance of racial balance of each of the schools. And usually the racial balance meant minority, majority level. So Black students were always the minority. My daughter would have to catch a bus on this corner, or I would have to drive her to the school, Lincolnwood School. Instead, I put her in a lottery to attend one of the magnet schools, and she ended up going to Bessie Rhodes instead, which was still closer than Lincolnwood. But just a few blocks over, one block over, some of her peers had to go to Willard, which is way over here. You also have Kingsley in this area where Foster School is, as well as this area here where they would end up going to Orrington. So that really divided up the student body and divided up parents who were actively involved in the PTA, who now to this day feel they don't have a voice in the say of what happens to the students. And the optics of that as well, too. When you have students from the 5th Ward being bused to all these different schools, and we have no control over the busing and the timing of that, and the timing after school. If the buses are late, the Black students are coming in late, and the perception is, oh, look, so-and-so is late to school. After school is over, a whole lot of students from the 5th Ward are boarding back a bus and going back to their neighborhood to have after-school activities in their neighborhood community centers, while other families who are walking around their school are engaged in school activities, after-school activities in their properties. And even to this day, there are families that have made mention that I've tried to be involved in the PTAs of these different schools, and sometimes I'm told to be quiet because this is not my neighborhood. So my voice is being silenced from that. And that's some of the outward impact of what happens when you close a neighborhood school that serves a particular population without effectively trying to integrate the whole school systems that's also tied to housing. So I went through this pretty quickly. Sometimes it's a bit longer, but I want to make sure we have enough time for our next speaker, who I appreciate all of her work that she does with her research, and I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say too. So thank you, and continue with the questions. I'll try and answer these as we move along.
Great. Thank you so much, Dino. We really appreciate that background and some history there. And now we are going to segue to our next speaker, Mary Barr. She's going to put up her presentation, and as she's doing that, I will read a quick bio for her. So Mary Barr is an assistant professor of sociology at Kentucky State University in Frankfort, Kentucky. She is the author of Friends Disappear, The Battle for Racial Equality in Evanston. She was recently awarded a National Endowment for the Humanities grant to work on her next book, which examines the history of residential segregation and the struggle for open housing in suburbs north of Chicago from 1853 to present. So with that, Mary, the stage is yours, and thank you for being here.
All right, thank you so much. I think I need a little help here because this is not where my presentation begins. Let's see.
So if you exit out of it and then go to your first slide and then hit play again, and then it should start at the beginning.
I'm not really seeing how to exit out though. Let's stop share maybe.
Yeah, stop share, then exit out, or yeah, end your presentation.
You guys help. All right. Okay, do you guys see me? Do you see the first slide now?
No, you have to share screen again.
All right. My apologies. Thank you, Dino, for helping me here. One second. There we go. And all right. Everybody see the first slide? All right, so hello, thank you so much. Thank you for putting together this panel. I am really excited to be here and to share what I know about Evanston's school desegregation plan. So before I get started, I want to dedicate this presentation to Evanston's civil rights heroes, and there are many more than you'll hear me talk about tonight, but they deserve to be commended for their hard work fighting to desegregate the city's schools in the 1960s. You probably recognize, lots of people on the call probably recognize the woman in the middle, that's Dolores Holmes. To her right is John Ingram, and he is sharing a sign that reads, "Evanston can be beautiful." And it's true, I do believe that. I believe that Evanston is poised to do the right thing, that it always has been poised to do the right thing, that there is possibility there. But unfortunately, the city has fallen short of its promise. So we're going to look at that today. In 1965, the city of Evanston hired Dr. Gregory Coffin to desegregate its schools. During his tenure, during Coffin's tenure, he said many times that the schools would never be fully integrated until there were integrated residential neighborhoods. And I think that it's important to understand that segregated schools are rooted in segregated neighborhoods. And Evanston, as you can see from this map, has very distinct Black and white sections of town. The majority of the Black people lived on the west side in what is, frequently just referred to as the Fifth Ward. So Evanston schools were no less segregated than schools in cities in the South. It's just that segregation was accomplished by different means. Southern cities had Jim Crow laws or de jure segregation that literally made it illegal for Black and white children to go to school together. In Evanston, Black and white children went to separate schools because the district was organized according to a neighborhood school model that created de facto segregation. So I want to dig in this next slide, dig in a little more and talk about what exactly a neighborhood school system is, or what the neighborhood school concept means. So neighborhood schools are elementary schools that are located in residential neighborhoods so that they are in easy walking distance for small children. So that small children can walk home, walk to school in the morning, walk home for lunch in the afternoon, back to school for the rest of the day, and then back home. Because children were able to do this, as Dino mentioned, the schools were built without cafeterias. So the bottom line here is that because again, segregated schools are rooted in segregated neighborhoods, the racial makeup of student bodies mirrored that of their residential areas. In Evanston, nearly all Black children went to either Foster or Dewey School, and the other schools were predominantly white. So you see, this is the Fifth Ward right here. And this is Foster School. I'm showing you guys with my cursor. I hope you can see it. And this is Dewey. So you can see it maps on perfectly. All right, a quick timeline so that you understand the events in the sequence that they happened. So Evanston basically was not complying with the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision that mandated that schools desegregate. And so Evanston's Black civil rights groups, including the NAACP and the Foster PTA, basically threatened the city with a lawsuit. In 1963, the superintendent of District 65, his name was Oscar Shute, he appointed or formed an advisory committee to study the problem. A year later, in 1964, the school board voted to end de facto school segregation in the elementary schools. And in 1965, a Citizens Advisory Commission on Integration was developed to create a student reassignment plan. Also, they were charged with hiring a new superintendent because Oscar Shute was getting ready to retire. And so they hired Dr. Gregory Coffin, a renowned educator from Connecticut. And Coffin started his job in the summer of 1966. He hit the ground running. He had lots of ideas. He was, ready to go. And I should point out that people did not like him from the beginning. So there was, even when he had just arrived, and there was already sort of rumblings about him. Anyway, he had a two-part plan for desegregation, and I'm going to go over in the next slides those parts, okay? I call it his plan, and I don't want to give the impression that there weren't lots of people involved, because there were many people that gave input and had influence. Just for the purposes of this talk, I'll call it Coffin's. It's easier to say that it's Coffin's plan. So part one was physical integration, and the first step was to close Foster as a neighborhood school and convert it to a magnet school that children across the city could apply to and attend. Now, the board worried, school board members worried that not enough white parents would send their children to a formally all Black school in a Black neighborhood. And so the board took measures to entice white parents to apply to send their children to this newly forming magnet school. So one of the things that the board did is they changed the name, right, from Foster to Lab. They also brought on board the Northwestern University Department of Education to help them create a new innovative curriculum that included all sorts of really cool things like art and music and foreign language and a new reading program. And so again, this was all just to entice white parents to apply to send their children to this new magnet school. So that was the first step, close Foster as a neighborhood school and convert it to a magnet school. And then the second step involved the computer generated redistricting. And this is actually a photograph of a man working on doing just that. So the second step involved computer generated redistricting so that each school reflected the city's demographics, approximately 22% African American and 78% white. The next step was to create a transportation plan, right? Like after the students had been reassigned to various schools so that the student bodies reflected the city's demographics as a whole, the district needed to figure out, okay, now how are we going to get them there? And so what they did is they created this massive busing program that would send Black, Dewey, and Foster students mostly to other elementary schools around the city. And as Dino also mentioned, parents were uneasy with this. They had never put their child on a bus before. They had only, seen their child. They could watch their child walk to school basically and watch them come back. They liked the idea of having their small child nearby in case of an emergency or in case they needed to bring something to the school. And so it was an unsettling feeling to put your child on a bus and send them across the city, right? But nevertheless, most parents, sort of approved of this plan. And on September 7th, 1967, students were bused to their new schools. And that was the first year that the school system as a whole was fully integrated. Now, as some of you guys know, I wrote a book, and some of you may have read it. And in the book, I interviewed people who had grown up in Evanston and who had been among the first to attend these newly integrated schools. And so I want to share with you some of their perspectives. One of the people that I interviewed was an African-American male named Jesse, and he was a foster student who was reassigned to Orrington. And in his interview, he told me he felt really kind of honored to be chosen. He felt he had been chosen to be one of the kids that was going to get bused to a new school. And so here in this quote, you can read, he said, "I fit the profile of one of the guys that would be easy to come into integration because I got along with pretty much anybody. So they asked my mom if it would be okay. They thought I was one of the gooder kids, so they wanted me to have a better chance. So they bussed me out over to Orrington School." So all in all, Jesse has good memories, positive memories of the experience. But I also interviewed someone named Chip, another African-American male. He was a foster student who was reassigned to Willard for his 5th grade year. So when he just had 1 year left at Foster, all of a sudden he was told he had to leave. And he was separated from the school that he was so familiar with, the teachers that he knew well, and his classmates. And he was, taken to Willard, as I said, reassigned to Willard for this 1 year. And in this quote, he's describing what it felt like that first day when the buses pulled up and he was on it. And he says, I felt kind of like, we were caged animals, but the white kids and their parents, they were out there and the buses pulled up and everybody's mouths are closed, but their eyes are wide open and they're looking. So he had a more negative, he has more negative memories of this time period than Jesse did. I also interviewed white students who were in this group. And what's really interesting to me is when I asked them, so what do you remember about this time period and integration and the first year and all of this? None of them had a clue that it had even happened. they were shocked, and in fact, to find out that it did. They knew nothing about it. And I think that's really interesting because what it tells us is that, you know, they didn't know because nothing for them really changed, right? Like their lives weren't uprooted like the Black children's lives were. You know, they continued to go to the same school, they continued to walk there, you know, et cetera. So busing was controversial, and as you know, I've said, the effects were not evenly distributed, but it was deemed necessary for the plan. Like it, you know, people thought, look, if we're going to integrate the schools, this is the only way. So we're just going to have to bite the bullet and do it. It did not cause the same fury that was beginning to unfold over school lunches. So the school board knew, remember the schools did not have cafeterias in them. And the school board knew that, and they knew that lunch was going to be a problem. They knew that there were other children, not only the bus children, but other children in the district that needed to stay at school for lunch. And if they didn't stay for lunch, that the bus children would end up having to just eat their lunches by themselves. So they were aware of all of these things, yet they voted 5-2 against an all-inclusive lunch plan for the fall of 1967. And here I have 2 quotes from board members who voted no, voted against an all-inclusive lunch plan. And here they are explaining they're explaining why they voted no. And so the first member says that, you know, I'm not in favor of sack lunches for everyone. The fact that some children have no adequate supervision at home at noon is a personal problem, not a district concern. The fact that the 5 school lunch programs will be segregated should have been thought of when we considered breaking up boundaries. And then the second member says, these things will snowball. We will see the expansion of this program in short order, and it will be a babysitting burden on the taxpayer, teacher, and administrator. And these board members, by the way, are representing a portion of the community who have a very conservative viewpoint and, you know, do not want to see things change. So that meant that the PTAs at the different elementary schools, the PTAs were left to develop their own plans, right? Because the school board said, we're not going to get involved. We're not going to do anything. It's up to the, you know, individual schools. So the PTAs basically kind of threw together these lunch plans. They got people to volunteer and staff them. They set up card tables and folding chairs. You can see in this photograph from the time period that the kids are just sitting at a card table. They have their sack lunches with them. They're eating. You can notice that there's no drinks on the table, and that's because this is before there's even milk provided, right? There's no like cartons of milk for the kids. I think it's important to understand that the school lunch program called for a deeper commitment to integration than maybe people were ready for. And here we have a parent who was quoted in the review, in the Evanston Review, excuse me. And this parent said, you know, I can't think of a better way to integrate the world than to sit down and eat together. And I agree, but again, the school board wasn't willing to to go that far. And it wasn't until the 1969-1970 school year, 2 years after, the schools integrated, that the school board accepted some responsibility, just a little bit. They provided some funds to the schools so that the schools could hire staff and not rely on volunteers to oversee the kids while they were eating. So integration really, came at the expense of Black children. that Black children lost their neighborhood school, right? They lost foster school. They had to, they went to school with white children, right? But they continued to be alienated. Busing made it really difficult for them to become an integral part of the school. They had to leave, as soon as the bell rang at the end of the day, they had to hop on the bus and go back to their neighborhoods. So they weren't really able to participate in after school programming. And they weren't really able to sort of, just hang out and play with their friends, right? Again, they had to leave pretty much right away. Also, without cafeterias, without, proper lunch programs, children, Black children, bus children ate by themselves while, in just kind of these ad hoc spaces, right? In gymnasiums or basements or wherever, while their white classmates went home for hot meals. Adding insult to injury, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated during the first integrated year. All right, part two. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but part two is, so part one, remember, was physical integration. Part two is about psychological integration. Coffin understood that true integration would require more than just racially balanced student bodies. Coffin so he went a step further, right? He felt his goal was psychological integration, and to do that, he hired and promoted Black teachers and administrators. He understood the importance of representation. He appointed Joseph Hill, who was the former foster principal, to be his assistant superintendent. Joseph Hill was an African-American man. He also advocated to keep cohorts together. He wanted the elementary schools to feed into the junior highs, and then the junior highs to feed into the high school hall system, so that the kids that were getting to know each other in the lower grades would continue to be together throughout their, school years in Evanston. And then finally, he overhauled the curriculum to include Black history and culture. Coffin believed that Evanston had what he called a Dick and Jane problem. You guys know Dick and Jane, the Dick and Jane readers, right? Dick and Jane are, it's a white boy and a white girl, and it's how we all, well, of a certain age, how we all learn to read. We read the Dick and Jane stories. To solve the problem, Superintendent Coffin said, or I'm sorry, not to solve the problem. So to explain the Dick and Jane problem, or to describe it, this is what Coffin said. He said, if you are not aware of the deeply embedded white racism which pervades the curricular materials used in schools throughout this country, thumb through a child's school books, look at the illustrations, read some of the tests, not just the reading book, but the arithmetic word problems, the science book experiments, the history book heroes, the inventors and discoverers. It's all white, not just white people, but white situations, white institutions, white frames of reference, and white is right conclusions. And so to fix this problem, the district actually, to overhaul and fix the curriculum, the district, received federal grant money to hold summer institutes during the summer of 1967 and 1968 to create new educational materials. And if you look on the right, I have to get some water. If you look on the right here, these are some of the manuals. These are some of the manuals that they created. And I'm going to take you inside just one of them. So this is the teaching manual on Black Power. And this was, again, developed during the Summer Institutes by District 65 teachers. And the booklets were really like lesson plans, right? So how to teach about different aspects of Black history and culture. And on the left hand of the screen, you can see that there were included in these manuals were lots of different ideas for class discussions, for homework assignments, and even for field trips. So they're pretty cool. I have to say, I was pretty happy when I found them in the archives. So by the summer of 1969, District 65 was well on its way to integration. The schools were racially balanced. There were lunch programs operating in all elementary schools with paid staff. There was an increased number of Black teachers and administrators. There was a new curriculum. Black and white friendships were made. And importantly, whites did not abandon their schools by fleeing Evanston or sending their kids to private schools as was happening elsewhere. Here's some photos that I really love, and I really like them. They're from the period, and I really like these photos because they show Black friendship, Black and white friendships, right? They show Black and white children playing together, dancing together, interacting, even touching. I think they're very, very powerful. And I think it's what a lot of adults that grew up in Evanston remember or think of when they remember their childhoods. And so that's why when white people find out that Evanston has this really kind of racist history, they're shocked, because this, again, these photographs, these images are how they remember Evanston. I also think that these photos speak to the possibilities that I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the talk, that, Evanston is poised to make, good choices and to, really be this great place. It's just that it doesn't always follow through. Despite his accomplishments, Coffin was fired in the summer of 1969. The school board voted to fire him, and said, basically they fired him in 69, but he had 1 year left on the contract. So what they were doing in effect was saying that his contract would not be renewed in June of 1970. The board announced that it would begin a search for a replacement immediately. And they were really kind of wishy-washy about why they were firing him, because there were a lot of people that thought he was doing a really good job. And so eventually, not until February 1970, they issued a written report outlining their grievances. And this is something that this booklet is something that I found in the archives at Northwestern, but I know that Shorefront also has a copy of it if you're interested in reading through it. Their reasons were mostly personal. They didn't like Coffin's leadership style. They said he was moving, quote, too far, too fast, unquote. They claimed that none of this had anything to do with the integration plan. But remember, they had voted against programs that would have enhanced the plan, like the school lunch program. Well, a good portion of the community was outraged. Coffin's defenders said that he was fired not because he was failing, but because he was succeeding. According to an editorial published in the Chicago Today newspaper, the school board wanted to reshuffle bodies. Gregory Coffin wanted to reshape minds, and people didn't like that. The board was willing to mix kids, but it bristled when Coffin presented resource manuals endorsing Black power. So advocates advocates, or people who were supporting Coffin, held marches like the picture on your screen here. They organized boycotts and rallies. They signed petitions. I mean, there was a big outcry from the community, so that finally the board, the school board was pushed into a corner, and they agreed to postpone Coffin's firing until after the April 1970 school board election. And it was at that time that 2 out of 3 members whose terms were ending and were also anti-Coffin, if they were replaced by pro-Coffin members, Coffin would get to keep his jobs. So 2 groups, I'm almost done. 2 groups assembled candidates. And the first group was a group that called themselves the Citizens for 65 slate. The Citizens for 65. And their slate included Bennett Johnson, who you see on the right of the screen, Betty Poppengelis, and Robert Marks. And again, if they won, then they would reinstate Coffin. They were pro-Coffin, and they would vote to keep him. It's important to know that Coffin had the backing of the Black community. The 2 pictures in the middle of your screen, the 2 snapshots, these are taken at the Citizens for 65 headquarters, which was housed in space at Ebenezer AME Church. It was donated by Reverend Jacob Blake. The space was donated so that they could work their campaign out of that space. The second group was named the Community Education Committee, or CEC, and their slate included Norma Eason, Sumner Rahr, and Martha Baumberger. If they won in April 1970, they would uphold the current majority's decision to oust Coffin, their term, right? All 3 of these candidates claimed to be for integrated education, but they lacked endorsement from Black groups. The election was held on April 11th, 1970. There was a pretty high turnout. People knew that there was a lot at stake in this election. Unfortunately, CEC defeated Citizens for 65, although it was pretty close. It was a pretty close election. And the new board, less than a week later, the new board removed Coffin from his post. He stayed on as a consultant until his contract ran out in June, but he was removed as superintendent, pretty much immediately. I included this flyer that I found in the archives because I just wanted to say that there were a lot of really nasty things said about Coffin, nasty letters that I read, and this is mild in comparison, but I just wanted to make the point. I wanted people to understand that that this really divided the community, and people were really angry and passionate about this issue. All right, finally, I'm going to end here. This is a picture of a mural that was that I took, a photograph that I took of a mural that was painted on a wall at the intersection of Emerson and Green Bay, right across the street from Hecky's Barbecue. And it was a mural. You can't see the whole thing in this picture, but it was a mural that depicted Evanston's school desegregation story. Coffin is not pictured. He's not even mentioned in it. And I found this to be very, very curious. I think that it is because the reason that Coffin is absent is because it's an embarrassing story for the community. You know, it really goes, you know, the Coffin story really kind of goes against the dominant narrative that the city really hangs onto so tightly of racial equality. If we included Coffin, we would be forced to face the fact that true integration was never achieved, and that in fact, we kind of sabotaged it. So with that, I will end and thank you and turn it back over to Ilana.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary. We really appreciate it. So we're going to segue now to, we have about, looks like about 20 minutes left. So we got a solid chunk of time to do some Q&A. Looks like people have been using the chat, which is great. Please continue to pop your questions in either like the Q&A section or just in the chat, up to you. But we're going to start with a couple of questions that both Mary and Dino, you all can answer and give your perspective. And then from there, we will answer any of the questions in the chat as well. Okay. So our first question is, what is a story that young people should be hearing about the legacy of their school system in Evanston?
I can go first on that. I think, you know, especially with what students learn in school today, when we talk about, you know, history and in lessons plans, I think a lot of times teachers tend to speak in like the past tense, and this happened everywhere else in the country but here. I think if students learn that what has transpired across the country had also transpired here in Evanston, I think it puts more of a personal and tangible touch to it. And it can also create new assignments and new opportunities for learning engagement where people who are involved in, let's say, desegregation of the school process are still living here today. So you can get firsthand experiences. So if anything, what students can learn from this is how national history has affected local history as well.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with that. I think, you know, when we learn about racism and segregation in our history classes, we learn about the South, right? We don't learn so much about the North or you know, even our own hometowns. So so I agree with that. You know, I was thinking about this question. We got the questions beforehand, just so everyone knows. So I had a little time to think about it. And I was thinking about how it might be important for kids to learn about language and be really kind of wary of the language that we use, because so much of the language that we use to describe segregation and racism in Evanston is really sugar-coated, right? So when we say, for example, racial imbalance, you know, that sounds like, oh, you know, it's a mistake. It was just a mistake and we have to like balance it out or something. The same with neighborhood school concept, right? A neighborhood school sounds nice. Like it connotes kind of tradition and I don't know, Americana, and just like it sounds good, right? But you know, it's important to understand again that, you know, neighborhood schools were used. I mean, that idea was used to segregate Black and white children. So I would just say that, yeah, it's important to learn how to decipher language.
Great. Thank you both. Okay. Our next question is, what are the unique qualities of our history that can be leveraged to pave a path forward towards a more equitable school system?
I think we have a very vocal community. Just, if you're an observer, even at Evanston, I think you see through all of our elections, all of our movements, you have many times visceral responses, thoughtful responses, and structured responses to a lot of social movements that had happened nationally that affect locally, but also local initiatives. Sometimes they're not well informed, and others are well informed, and it provides a lot of opportunity for discussion. So I think Evanston's interesting where people are not afraid to voice their opinion, roll up their sleeves, and get to work. Even if it might be in the wrong direction at times. I mean, looking back at the school desegregation process, I talked to a lot of adults who lived through that process, or were a part of that process, or teachers who were during that process. Note now that there were some mistakes that were made and assumptions of this is toward equity, but what it ended up doing in the end was diluting the power of the Black community to be self-sufficient. So there are, there are movements now, and I think many people today are actually taking that lens of approach of how we have to dismantle more of a larger institutional type practices in order to manage and change the micro.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think one of the things that makes Evanston really unique is this history of multiracial struggle, especially when it comes to especially when it comes to education and housing. Both of those struggles included both Black and white activists working together. And I think that that's unique and unusual and really powerful. And so, and I think it continues today too. So yeah, I think that is, and, building on that is really an important way forward.
Thank you both so much. We want to make sure that we have some time to get into some of the questions from our Q&A chat. So I'm just going to read through the first one. Dino, I think this one's directed to you. Why do you think the Black community allowed Noyes School, which was a naturally integrated school in the 5th Ward, to be closed?
I wish I had more information on Noyes School. My focus has always been on Foster and Foster specifically. I think Noyes School falls right outside the 5th Ward. It's right on the border almost, though, the 1st Ward and approaching the 5th Ward. But in talking to residents, for example, Bennett Johnson that Mary Barr had mentioned before, where he used to live growing up, he would have been slated to go to Noyes School, but yet he was pushed to go to Foster instead. So I'm not quite sure, and I think there's probably people who are on this Q&A chat or participants listening in on this that might know more about that. I think the school district was more responsible for citing what schools should be closed for redistricting. And I don't know, and Mary can correct me if I'm wrong, that the residents had necessarily a full say in how that is redistricted. Foster School was closed, but also Noyes was closed as well. And I know there are other schools in history, like Central School was closed, and there are several other schools that were closed because of demographic shifts and change. So some of that plays a part of it. But for a neighborhood school such as Foster to close that had serviced one particular community was much more impactful than that of Noyes and comparatively Dewey School, which was also a naturally integrated school at the time.
There is a comment in our chat from Anita who says, my recollection of the closing of Noyes School is that Noyes or Orrington was to be closed. The question was which one? Supporters of Orrington emphasized that Noyes's Noyes School's location immediately adjacent to a commercial area, and the L stop favored repurposing, although I don't know to what extent that factored in the decision to close it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anita.
The next question, has anyone done any research on why the school board thinks that they need a community vote to open a school in the 5th Ward? They did not have a vote from the community when they closed the school in 1979.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question one more time? I just want to make sure I understand it.
Sure. It says, has anyone done any research on why the school board, so this might be a current question, thinks that they need a community vote to open a school in the 5th Ward when they did not have a vote from the community when they closed the school in 1979. And Sarita is mentioning in the chat that she's currently doing this, and this is going to be the topic of our next discussion on a 5th Ward school and having a more current perspective on this.
So I do know that there is a team of people looking at opening a new school in the 5th Ward, whether it's a STEM school, a magnet school, various looks at that. I do know that the organizer of this do not want it to go on a voting ballot as a referendum. It should be placed because there is a need. We saw what happened with the last referendum in 2012, where opening a new 5th Ward school was a public discourse in what is needed. And what was illustrated, effectively in that graph that you showed in the 6th and 7th Ward, where they overwhelmingly did not support it. I had an interesting conversation with a group of people who lived in that ward and the reasons why they voted against it. And they feared that their taxes were going to go up, even though the stats show that actually their taxes were going to go down. An old referendum, school bond had expired, so the taxes were being lowered. So a new bond will be submitted for a new 5th Ward school, so the bond would raise the taxes, but it will still come lower than what the previous amount was. And at that time too, it was more affordable to build something new because the economy was ripe for it. And then secondly, they were scared that it would mess up their integrated school. And they liked that feeling of, we have, people of color in our school, but they weren't, a big factor in the makeup. It was still a minority majority type of situation. As I stated earlier in the presentation, that Black families coming from the 5th Ward felt had no power in those schools, had no sense of say or community in those schools. So disrupting that aspect of it came into play. Third, a lot of people were still dealing with 1960s demographics. They see 5th Ward as all Black when the demographic shift in the 5th Ward is changing. So if a new 5th Ward school opened up, it would be probably a naturally diverse school, but this time minority majority. And in some definitions and people's definition, that doesn't constitute a well-integrated school. I look at Harvey, Illinois at times, and at one point it was cited as integrated, but when it became minority majority, it was no longer integrated. It was a Black community. And I think that's how a lot of people tend to see how integration happens in the 5th Ward.
Thank you so much. In our closing 5 minutes, maybe one last question we'll take are, what were the teachers' responses to desegregation?
I mean, I think they were varied, but I think that, well, I guess I'm not sure if I understand the question. What were the teacher responses to desegregation?
I couldn't, I guess, I don't know if Mary and I can actually, I think if people listening in who were teachers at that time period have a better way of answering that question. But I think if the move was to desegregate, then the teachers would have to be on board to develop new programming to figure it out. With foster school being that model for it was more cooperation. I would be curious to know what teachers thought outside of the school system, out of foster school, understanding that more Black students were coming in. From stories I've had from families, especially Black families, I remember them saying that they wanted my child to go to, say, Nichols, for lack of for example, because my student is doing very well. So we've done that. My child would fit well in that class and not disrupt the social status of that school. So a lot of times that happened. So it's selective integration in selective circumstances, but it was also a slow process in accepting of norms, set norms that were set for decades earlier. You can't change that overnight.
Yeah, I mean, I know that there were a lot of teachers that supported Coffin, so that tells me that, they were really happy with the direction that he was going in. They, were standing behind him. They created a group when the school board did fire him. They created a group that I'm so sorry I can't remember the name of the group, but I do remember that it was headed by what's his first, Mr. Hannon. He was my principal at Dewey. I forgot his first name. Anyway, he was like, he spearheaded this group. He was involved and sort of directed it. And they were really, really supportive again of the different initiatives that Coffin was, had introduced. They were on board with, the direction that everything was moving in, and they were really very devastated when the board fired him. So I obviously can't speak for every teacher. I don't think, I think that there were probably different opinions and perspectives, but I do believe that the majority of teachers in District 65 were behind him and behind the integration plan.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for such an informative and robust presentation tonight. I know that there were questions in the Q&A that we weren't able to get to tonight, but we are going to be able to save those questions to try to incorporate into our next session. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Dino. We are so honored to be on this call with you, and I will hand it off to the library to close us out.
Thank you so much, everyone. It has been a wonderful evening. I want to again thank Dino Robinson and Mary Barr for those presentations. We really appreciate your participation tonight. And also thanks to Alana and Blair for moderating and for your introduction. The library is very happy to participate in sessions like this. And I just want to remind all the attendees that next week we will have part 2 of this conversation, where we will be joined by Sarita Smith, who is the manager of student assignment at District 65, Henry Wilkins from the STEM School, Evanston, and Karen Danzak-Lyons from Evanston Public Library. And the evening will be moderated by students from Evanston Township High School's Emerge Club. So I encourage everyone to attend next week on Thursday, May 20th at 7 p.m. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to us at the library. Our website is epl.org. And we look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you very much.